We've got a fairly packed agenda. We've got a couple of really interesting presentations that we've selected from the various chapters of the annual review, and I'll come to those in a moment. We'll then go to the panel discussion. We've given a very strict, I think it's 4 minutes to each of our panelists, and then we're going to open it up to wider Q&A. The way that will work, as many of you will know already from participating in these kinds of online events, it's a Zoom webinar, which means that you can type into the Q&A box, you can upvote questions, and then I will be reading those questions out on your behalves, and the panel and our speakers will respond to them. So the first kind of agenda item is me, really, just to give a few words by way of introduction. And I think the first thing that I would just really want to do before I say anything else is to thank everyone who's been involved with the production of the annual review and associated things that we've been doing, such as the video that we've produced, which I'm told has already had hundreds of views on Twitter, and all of the associated activities that the UK HQ team do in order to make UKERC work, and our wider set, I think, of over 100 people that are involved in one way or another with the consortium and my fellow co-directors. So annual review, as it suggests, as the name on the tin suggests, it's looking back across the events of the year. It's a policy review, so we're very much focused on the policy issues of the day. We're the UK Energy Research Centre, so we're focused on things to do with energy and climate change. I think if you, reflecting back on the focus of some of our previous annual reviews and on the events that have unfolded during 2021, we've had a strong focus over the years on climate policy and on the net zero agenda and things associated with that. And that certainly continues in the current this year's annual review of energy policy, and it's been a really busy year. What with starting at the end of last year with the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green recovery and ambitious proposals across the piece for development of clean technology with a focus on the energy sector. In the run-up to COP26, which obviously the UK hosted or co-hosted, but was based up in Glasgow, we've seen a raft of announcements across different sectors, industry, heat and buildings, the transport sector, and so on. But what we've also, and a net zero strategy, an overarching net zero strategy, and all of those things are reflected in the annual review. But what we've also seen in the last few months are some pretty unprecedented events in the kind of, if you like, the kind of non-carbon aspects of UKERC's brief. So we've seen gas prices reach unprecedented highs. We've seen energy suppliers going out of business, left, right, and centre. For a few weeks, we had a kind of panic buying, queues at petrol pumps type of thing. And so we've brought some of those issues into the annual review. It would be quite strange if we didn't. But the other thing that we focused on, and we're going to talk about gas prices and gas security this afternoon, and it's obviously a very contemporary thing. But the other thing that UKERC has in its range of activities is actually a theme which is focused on the wider environment. So what I'm talking about there is the kind of non-carbon aspects of the environmental impacts of energy supply. And that's hugely important as well. We need to be looking for those co-benefits, but we also need to understand when there might be trade-offs. And so for that reason, we've included discussion of those issues in the annual review this year. And we've included in the form of my colleague Nicky, a presentation talking about those kinds of things, and we'll be reflecting upon some of those things when we come to the panel and the panel comments as well as in her presentation. The first presentation, though, is from Mike Bradshaw, and Mike is a long-standing expert and commentator. I suppose it would be fair to say on the geopolitics of energy, Mike, and on many things to do with oil and gas supply, and on the kind of relationship between the fossil fuels that we're still very dependent on and the transition and the aspirations that we have to move towards low carbon. And he's going to be picking up on some aspects of that, talking about the kind of need for what we call gas by design. And I'm going to stop talking now, hand over to Mike. I think he's sharing his own slides to give his presentation. Thanks very much, Mike.
So hopefully that is clear and everyone can see the slides. So the first thing I did in preparing this contribution to the 2021 review was actually to go back to the 2017 review, which is actually the earliest I can find. So I think that is, it is 5 years. And in that, Paul Ekins and I wrote a story for the report, which was called Still No Sign of Gas by Design. So that was 5 years ago. So in some senses, there's nothing new about what we're saying. We've been saying it for a long time. But what has happened, of course, is the consequences of not actually having a gas strategy have become quite stark. So what I want to do in my short presentation is to talk through the issues behind the short piece that's in the review. And some of this will be very familiar to some of you, others perhaps not. One of the things I did do was go back through previous Dukes to look at the gas flow diagram. And one thing seems to be happening is the lines are getting thinner because the volumes of gas are changing. But the story remains pretty familiar. Our gas demand is divided into 3 sectors: power generation, domestic heat, and industry. And actually, there are sections in the report that talk to some of these key issues, particularly the future of domestic heat, the need to decarbonize, and thus resulting in the reduction of demand for gas, but also the industrial decarbonization strategy, which also is seeking to find alternatives to fossil fuels to gas as a source of heat and as a feedstock. And of course, one of the things that the gas crisis has highlighted is the non-combustible use of natural gas in the energy sector. And we've heard about shortages of carbon dioxide, for example. So I think that the public now are much more aware of the role that natural gas plays, not just in power generation and heat, but in industry more generally. So given the discussions about decarbonizing, continuing to decarbonize the power system, the Prime Minister has talked about a totally green power system by 2035. That would result in a significant reduction in gas demand, the need to find low carbon solutions to industrial processes likewise, and of course, the need to decarbonize heat. So the future of gas demand it has to be reduced to stay on track to meet net zero. And that's the backstory. We're not saying it shouldn't fall. We're saying we should manage the transition in terms of the future of gas. So if I can move forward to the next slide. So this sort of summarizes kind of, if you like, the party line. It's come from Ofgem. And much of the sort of government's response to the current gas crisis and their own sort of statutory assessments of gas security have stressed 2 things. One is that we have a significant infrastructure, which is highlighted in this graph in terms of pipelines, LNG import terminals, interconnectors to the European gas market, and then onshore the national transmission system. We have a limited amount of storage, which we all know about now, and that we have a diverse source of supply geographically. Both of those are true, but the fine detail in those reports always ends by commenting that our ability to import through pipelines and via LNG is dependent on price signals. And that has been the problem this autumn, is that what has been happening globally has really been challenging in terms of the kind of prices that consumers need to pay in the UK to attract the gas that we need to satisfy demand. So if I move on, one of the things that's been happening is we've been relying to a greater extent in recent years on the supply of liquefied natural gas, LNG supply. And we have a splendid LNG tanker on the front of our report this year. But there have been changes taking place also on our LNG supply. So our gas imports are roughly split between pipeline gas from Norway, Norway is supplying us, but Norway is also supplying continental Europe. So in a sense, we are in competition with European consumers. A very small amount of gas coming through the two interconnectors that connect us to Belgium and the Netherlands. And then 42% of imports, about over 20% of total consumption coming as LNG. But in recent years, there's been a diversification of LNG supply. If you went back to 2012, 90% came from Qatar. Today, we have a diversity of supply with new sources of supply coming online from the United States and Russia. And in fact, one of the first cargoes out of the Yamal Peninsula in the Arctic from Russia came just after the Beast from the East a couple of years ago. So we have a diversity, but that also reflects the fact that we're probably increasingly in global competition for our gas. And this is what has been the problem this autumn, and it's what this particular chart highlights. Now, the theme that I co-direct in UKERC is called UK Energy in a Global Context. And I think this particular graph highlights that particular challenge. LNG as an increasing part of our gas supply means we're in global competition. And a very tight market that we have today means we're in direct competition with buyers in Asia, in China, South Korea and Japan, to access flexible spot price LNG. And so the two lines you see skyrocketing here, on the one hand, are the Asian spot price, the JKM, Japan Korea marker, and our own UK price, the national balancing point price. And you can see, and if we added a third, which would be the Dutch TTF price, it would be doing much the same, though slightly lower than the UK price, because we now have to trade our gas at a premium to compete with European buyers. That this is what is happening. We're in global competition for a tight supply of LNG. And our price is having to reflect what it is necessary to attract that gas to our shores. And this is one of the problems, is that because it's global in origin, there's a limited amount the government can actually do about it. And actually prices hit a new record high yesterday. And part of that is because in hand with the LNG crisis, we have a shortfall in gas storage in Europe and problems with the supply of gas from Russia and a complex geopolitics surrounding that. At the same time, the role that gas is playing in our power generation mix is changing, and we now have a system where we have nuclear baseload and an increasing amount of flexible wind, and in between, gas is playing a role of flexibility, of balancing the electricity generation system. And I checked the national grid prevailing view that today 52% of power generation comes from fossil fuels, 47.9% from gas, 4.6% from coal, and 23% from wind. And we do seem to be moving into one of those blocking high pressures where there's no wind, no sun, and temperatures start to fall. And that's again part of the reason for gas prices spiking yesterday. We have had some cold weather. So things are pretty jittery. So in this graph also demonstrates that gas is playing a key role in supporting renewable penetration, in backing up wind. What it doesn't capture particularly well is the other energy system service gas plays in terms of providing energy for winter heating. You know, the surge in gas demand in the UK comes in the winter. And because we don't have very much storage left at all now, in those winter months when gas prices are high, we're having to compete to bring in gas on a sort of just-in-time basis to meet our gas demand. So what's going to happen in the future? This is taken from the Oil and Gas Authority, and it's sort of suggesting a particular view of the future in terms of a pattern of falling demand as required, but a more rapid rate of production decline. And we discussed the future of the UKCS in the report. And therefore, we see a picture of an increasing level of import dependency, but against the backdrop of a smaller level of demand. So fewer consumers being exposed to greater risk is one way of looking at this. Now, that demand curve, the falling demand curve, it's itself subject to a good deal of uncertainty. And that's reflected in this slide, which is showing us, it's taken from the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget, a range of scenarios in terms of what happens with future gas demand. And their balanced net zero pathway, the intermediate pathway, is seeing a significant reduction in gas demand. So the question really is, how do we manage this phasing down of gas in terms of keeping in place the infrastructure and the ability to increasingly import the gas that we need. That is the challenge, and that really requires a strategy to think about gas by design, gas in the low carbon transition. So to finish off then, there's a quote here from the World Energy Outlook from the IEA, I think, because one of the things is, the current energy crisis is making us realize is the challenge of what I would call managing the high carbon transition away from fossil fuels. We need to do this at the same time as we emphasize the growth of clean energy to ensure security of supply. So they say, unless the transition is well managed, remaining customers of natural gas would be at risk of supply shortages or volatility during the process of phasing out supply lines or deliveries. So we have two asks really. One is kind of short term. It's to go back to the 2017 strategic assessment of gas security to consider things that have impacted since, such as the impact of Brexit, lessons from the current crisis and the consequences of net zero. And second, it's to ask for what we asked for back in 2017, a review as promised in the net zero strategy on the role of gas in the energy transition to develop a gas by design approach. So I hope that 5 years from now, I probably won't be writing the UKERC energy policy review, but we will be in a position where we do have a gas by design strategy and we're able to cope with the kind of challenges that we're facing this winter. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Mike, that was absolutely terrific. And you kept to time extremely well. Also, I think the kind of light bulb moment for me was when I saw a graph similar to the price graph that you just showed, where, because I've always said, boom and bust, prices go up, prices go down, that's the nature of the beast. But having to change the scale on the axis in order to fit what's happened recently onto the graph seems to me to be something that we need to be paying attention on. And thanks also for mentioning the UKCS, because I forgot to say that we've got an item on that in the review as well. Certainly something that we might come back to. I'm going to move more or less straight to Nicky, just to say we've already got a few questions coming through. Please type them into the Q&A box. I think you might also be able to type into the chat, but to avoid confusing me and my little brain trying to look at more than one set of text boxes at the time, please put your questions into the Q&A, and that has the wonderful opportunity to thumbs up them, which means you upvote them, and so we can run a kind of popularity contest for your questions at the same time, and who doesn't enjoy that? So anyway, Nicky, thanks for joining us, and I think you're sharing your own slides too, and over to you.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Nicola Beaumont from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and as Rob said, I'm also a co-director at UKERC. The theme that I lead is investigating energy, environment, and landscapes and the interactions between these. And our contribution to this energy policy review was really to investigate the question around whether we can achieve decarbonisation whilst maintaining environmental standards. Now, the challenge here is really driven by this need to decarbonise in order to achieve these net zero targets. Now, clearly these net zero targets, which we have here in the UK, but also across Europe and indeed across the world. So this is a global challenge. There's been a host of different policies and strategy documents released about how we can decarbonise our systems, not least how we decarbonise our energy systems. And these, again, both here in the UK and across the world. At the same time as these being released, we've seen an increase in the amount of environmental legislation and policy being developed. Here in the UK, a couple of years ago, we had the 25-year plan. And since Brexit, it's been a really interesting time with the new Environment Bill being developed and the Agricultural Transition Plan. So a lot of changes here regarding environmental policy in the UK, and a real drive to ensure that the environment is protected and enhanced going forward. I think one of the key reasons for this, one of the real drivers behind this valuing the environment more fully, is that there's an increasing appreciation of the fact that we need a healthy environment if we are going to have a healthy economy and a healthy society. The Disruptor Review, released recently, made a very clear case for this, that our economy is directly linked to our biodiversity. So conservation and maintaining a good and sustainable environment is no longer a luxury. It's actually integral to our society and economic development. And again, this is an issue that's been raised not just here, but across the world. Now, the challenge really is, how do we link these two things? The difficulty we have is that many of the strategies that are being put in place to achieve decarbonisation can potentially have a direct negative impact on the environment. Now, these are very broad ranging, but to give you a couple of examples, many of the renewable energy strategies which are being put in place take up a huge amount of land. They take up a vast amount of space. And in converting space that may previously have been wild or previously farmed into space which is now used solely for renewable energies, we have a risk of losing biodiversity. Likewise, another example would be the fact that many of these decarbonisation strategies require new raw materials, which will be taken from across the world, again, potentially impacting biodiversity in these places. So there is this very strong risk that achieving the top arc here of decarbonising our systems will have a very negative effect on the bottom arc here of maintaining the good environmental standards. However, we think that if we approach this by harmonising these two arcs, that we actually will be able to not only prevent environmental degradation and loss, but there's a good chance that we can end up with co-benefits. So in achieving our decarbonisation, we're looking at radically changing how we are behaving and how we are acting within our systems. And we can work with this transition to hopefully actually have a positive effect on the environment. So instead of conflicting, the two arcs I'm showing here can actually support each other and positively interact. An example of this that's not related to the energy system, but I think we can possibly learn something from, is in the recent COP, 141 countries agreed to reverse forest loss and land degradation. And the core aim for this was focused around climate change. It was around reducing carbon, but it will also have a positive effect from a biodiversity perspective, provided it is well managed. So this is our challenge, is how we bring together the decarbonisation of our system with maintaining environmental quality. I should say that this is very much a two-way street, because equally in developing our decarbonisation strategies and policies, there is a risk that some of the environmental policies and strategies that we put in place may inhibit our chances of decarbonising effectively. So, for example, if we protect vast tracts of land and decide against development in those areas, it may hold back the decarbonisation of our systems. So how are we doing with this in the UK? This is where I want to begin. Are we managing to bring together our decarbonisation environmental policies? Now, interestingly, despite sometimes the perception we may have, the UK is actually a global leader in terms of its environmental quality. Here is some data that I've just brought to you today, which shows the Environmental Performance Index of a range of different countries. And you can see the UK in 2020 was ranked 4th. Now, this includes not just the environmental quality in the UK, but also it includes environmental policies. So how environmental policies and legislation are brought together. Likewise, although we know there are problems with the decarbonisation strategies which are being put forward, again, I think it is not unreasonable to say that the UK is showing a degree of leadership in this regard. So individually, in these two sectors, there is definitely leadership. However, what we find is that these policy documents very rarely the decarbonisation policy documents very rarely make any reference to environmental objectives. And likewise, the environmental policy documents very rarely make any mention of decarbonisation. Now, the risk here is obviously that each one will continue along its own track, ignoring the other, and we will miss opportunities for co-benefits. We will not fully understand the trade-offs that are being made between the two. So we have these two potentially conflicting policy developments. And at the moment in the UK, documentation that brings these two things together is certainly atypical. Now, that said, there are some nascent developments that are bringing these together, but it is nascent. And a couple of examples would be the recent shared policy programme between the SNP and the Green Party. Again, it's not perfect, but there's steps towards this in there. There's the Oxford and Cambridge ARC, which is very much focused on bringing not just the energy needs of those communities together, but also the environmental needs. And there are interdisciplinary programs which inform policy, like UKERC, who are aiming to inform policy about how to bring these things together. So there is activity here in the UK around this. It's just that it's very much in a nascent state. So what lessons can we learn from the global community? And this was very interesting, going and seeing what we could find more broadly. And to be honest, I think generally the rest of the world isn't doing so much better than the UK in this, but there are some lessons to be learned. One thing that is fascinating is that in some countries, responsible national bodies are actually brought together. So, for example, in the Costa Rica, there is a minister for the environment and energy. They sit together in one body. And I think compared to the UK, where DEFRA and BEIS, for example, are still very separate, this is certainly a lesson that we could possibly learn, because by sitting together in the same place, you're more likely to achieve the synergistic policy development that's really needed. A second thing is that across the world, we see a great deal of use of financial instruments. So if we can understand and value in monetary terms what happens to the environment under different decarbonisation strategies, it puts us in a much stronger place to understand the trade-offs which are undertaken when decarbonisation activities are put into place. So using financial mechanisms such as payment for ecosystem services, as they have done in Costa Rica, can really provide transparency to those trade-offs. And finally, a really nice example where the German government have actively commissioned a whole range of projects about how the expansion of their renewable energy will affect their environment, with a core aim of ensuring that the future energy system is nature compatible. So 3 take-home messages with regard to UK taking leadership in the future. The first one is that UK environmental policies must be more carefully harmonised with decarbonisation strategies. The second one is around the fact that respective bodies would really benefit from working together more closely, both at national and international levels. And the third one is that we can hopefully deploy economic analysis and financial mechanisms, which would provide far better transparency around the trade-offs that we're making when we follow that arc of decarbonisation strategy or that arc of environmental strategy, and what the trade-offs are when we follow those two paths. And I think, just a final word, there's a lot to be gained by this. If we don't actually take leadership in this role, there's a real risk that we'll be exchanging one crisis, that of climate change, for another one, that of biodiversity loss, with both having huge social and economic implications. And if we do take leadership here, there's a real opportunity for co-benefits. That was all.
Thanks very much, Nicky. Sorry, that again. So I missed what you just said.
I just said thank you so much for listening.
Oh, well, it's really interesting. Thanks very much for the presentation, and again for keeping very well to time. If I could ask the panelists to turn their cameras on now, because we're going to move to the kind of round table component of the proceedings. Thanks very much. And Mike, you might want to rejoin us on camera as well. So we're going to run now for 15 minutes or so with 15-20 minutes or so with some, and the running order that I've got, and I think the participants know this. Sorry if you don't, but we're going first with Maureen, and then Doug, then Beth, then Jim. Okay, so some comments from you first, please, Maureen. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rob, for giving me the chance to reflect on the review. And I think that it is an important reminder to all of us who play a part in the UK's transition to net zero that there is still a long way to go. And in some ways, we know that. But, you know, the constructive scrutiny, I think, is vital in keeping us all honest about how well we are doing and how, you know, what we have to do to bridge the gaps that exist. Leadership is a key theme. But leadership is not all about achieving first. And I think the paper by Imogen and Peter at the University of Leeds make that point. Yes, it's about getting there. It's about reaching the target. But for me, it's a race where leaving anyone else behind isn't going to work. So in terms of action, which I would say is a rallying cry of the review, a key takeaway for me is about being joined up, right? Effective action means being joined up nationally, so thinking about the co-benefits, which we've just heard about, but also internationally. And that is why at COP26, Ofgem, we brought together global energy regulators and international organizations to launch our Regulatory Energy Transition Accelerator. And that is intended to enhance the capacity of energy regulators to increase the speed of energy transition. So there's a lot about knowledge sharing, peer-to-peer learning. And as Nicky mentioned at the end, it's about learning from others as well as they learning from us. So it has to be that sharing of knowledge. So I really love the point that Nicky ended on, because for me, that is a key reflection and the reason behind our accelerator.
Okay, Maureen, thank you. Sorry, thanks for that. And I was lucky enough to go along to the to your chief executive's presentation at COP. And all I'll say is that for reasons unknown to me, it took place in a distillery. I'll make no further comments other than it's just a fact. It was next to the COP site, a very nice location it was too, but not, I think, chosen by Ofgem, but rather apt and unusual, I think. Thanks again, and over to you now, Doug.
I'm sure you were very upset about that, Rob.
It was awful, yeah.
So, yeah, thanks for the presentations, Mike and Nicky. I was going to confine my comments to gas, but I'm going to put in something about environment and climate at the end. The first thing, of course, to say is the bleeding obvious, which is climate change is not going away. We've seen over the summer that it's getting worse, and this is just at 1.1 degrees, or maybe at 1.15. It's not going away, it's going to get worse. The urgency of action is now very strong. And we're already starting to go into the period where long-lived infrastructure, even at 2050, is, or new infrastructure, I should say, is going to be looking out of date. The next things I'm going to say are really about the politics of it. Because I was struck by some of the graphs that Mike was using, illustrating price spikes, and the Sankey diagram at the beginning showing that building heat is now actually more in terms of final end use. Just domestic heat is now more than is in use in electricity, and how politics in the UK, not just in the UK, seems to have a structural difficulty in getting hold of using of addressing the demand side rather than just going after, in a rather macho way, more supply. And that seems to be a constant theme. We would be in a lot better place if we had not just simply pursued supply as the main option for pursuing what is generally termed security. Although I'm not going to spend any time trying to unpack what that means. It can mean a lot of different things to different people. And yet at the same time, this summer, the political conditions of low wind, price spikes, difficulties with interconnectors, etc., were absolutely golden to make the demand side and reduction of building emissions, for example, and gas use in building emissions, absolutely perfect for advancing that agenda. But yet what we actually found was government choosing to use it for looking at more supply options, in particular nuclear, which isn't going to be can't be done. Nothing is going to happen with new nuclear in terms of any decisions taken now until the mid-2030s. So it's all a bit bizarre. And one of the structural failings that constantly try and draw attention to, but really struggle with. The third thing I would say about the politics of this is that gas by design in the UK sector ultimately means dealing with emissions from the North Sea and extraction from the North Sea. And we can already see the germs of some pretty crunchy politics going on around that, where in new exploration in the North Sea is being contested, but some of the Scotland politics is around exploiting that to say, vote for us around Aberdeen, to put it bluntly. Vote for us because we'll protect your jobs. We won't do any of that naughty stuff like reducing the amount of exploitation in the North Sea. And that's going to be another one of those real pinch points around the politics of actually driving change in the UK. Finally, because I'm almost up from my 4 minutes, I just wanted to say something about what Nicky said, because there are certainly issues around the broad exploitation of renewable energy and the environment. Particularly at the moment, it's the vast expansion of offshore wind into the North Sea and other parts of the UK coast does pose some environmental challenges. But I would draw attention to the fact that firstly, most of our decarbonisation objectives are not going to be met if we do not deliver large-scale offshore wind. And secondly, the planning and grid processes around delivering in a cost-effective way without damaging biodiversity, that large-scale expansion in offshore wind are simply not there. They need to be brought together to give a coherent spatial strategy that means we put in the right place the offshore wind that is least damaging for biodiversity, most cost-effective for the grid. And if we can do that, then that would be genuine world leadership. But right now, we're a long way from it. And I'm going to be talking to the RSPB and other environmental groups yet again tomorrow about trying to take that forward. Thanks very much.
Okay, interesting stuff there, Doug. And I think we're going to pick up on some of those threads in the discussions. I saw you nodding to some of the things that he was saying there, Beth, about offshore wind. Just to say before you start, at the moment it seems as if Jim Watson is dropping in and out of the call. So I assume he's got some internet connection problems at home. I'm hoping, or wherever he is, I'm hoping he'll rejoin us in order to make his comments. As and when he does, I'll bring him in. We may need to go to Q&A before he arrives. But anyway, thanks, Doug, and over to you, Beth.
Okay, thank you. Yes, a lot of agreement across us so far. So I'm going to be coming at this from a marine ecologist perspective on maintaining environmental sustainability of our oceans. So very much on Doug's last point. And I have two short points I want to cover on aspects the report picks up on. One on just transitions, and the other one on joining up of policies and the working together of a range of governmental groups, as Nicky has pointed out. So I call these 2 points conflict and free energy. And to start with conflict, this is related to the just transition. So I've heard it said that it just takes too long to talk to everybody. This is a climate emergency. We must get offshore renewables in right now as fast as possible. However, I would say that the evidence is that where there is conflict and people feel their voices are not being heard, very much as Maureen was saying, that they will push back very strongly and rightly so. So active upfront, real participation and giving people a voice and an actual seat at the table for decision making will actually speed up agreement on offshore renewable developments. As I so eloquently heard from as being a participant of COP26 myself, I heard this from a very impassioned young woman from Africa that said, Indigenous peoples are not victims, they are the solution. And I would say that looking at our own backyard in the UK, just insert local for Indigenous, and that indeed local and concerned people with a real voice and real power within decision making will allow us to be much more likely to provide a just transition without such a high level of conflict, and therefore speed things up. And on my second point of free energy, what I mean here is the fact that I've heard so many economists say that offshore wave, wind, tide, solar energy is just free for the taking. And this is simply not the case, because taking away energy from wind and waves, for example, is the energy that would have gone in to mix our oceans. And that mixing produces plankton, and that's the base of the marine ecosystems. So let's not make the same mistake we did thinking that there's nothing to fear from, the production of carbon dioxide, odorless, colorless, harmless gas. We've got to consider these environmental effects of energy extraction up front. What we absolutely need to do is to think at the moment about where and how exactly, as Doug would say, how much extraction of renewable energies can be done in an environmentally sustainable way. We can't slow this down, we need to do it. But some of the solutions are indeed, as Nicky pointed out, that these groups of scientists and policymakers really working together. So that's what you hear in the report. But a particular solution for our Cs that I'd like to bring up is we can bring the policies that require, say, things like environmental impact assessments and cumulative assessments. These are all currently done by the industry. We could align them with the UK marine strategy policies we have for our much wider regions and what we call being in good environmental status. It's because at the moment, these two policies spin independently beside each other. They could easily be connected with industry putting money into a large pot for rapid ecosystem assessments of these effects of offshore renewables, such that we can move forward rapidly as possible. And again, with some assurance then that we're actually doing things environmentally sustainably as possible. So those are my points. Thank you.
Okay, interesting stuff. Thanks very much, Beth. Okay, Jim, you have disappeared, come back, disappeared and come back. Are you, can you hear us all right?
I can, courtesy of Virgin Media, who are not being my best friend today.
That's no problem. Over to you if you can to make your comments now.
I will. I'll try and make them quickly before they decide to pull the plug again. But yeah, so thanks to inviting me back to comment on the review. I think you're right with the 5-year anniversary. I mean, I think looking at what you've said on the big picture, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise with the way I now approach this, which is it's less about the strategies and the announcements of targets. It's actually what government and others are doing that matters. It's a question I got in the run up to COP26 a lot. How do we know that we can get countries to honour pledges? And it's, well, keep an eye on what they're actually doing over the coming months and years, rather than bringing out yet more strategies and consultations. I was also thought it was good overall you're highlighting fairness in there, here and there. You did have a passing mention to the protests that happened around, or at least the unrest around, access to fuel, the security issue that Mike has raised with respect to gas. But I think interestingly, the high prices haven't sent us into a negative spiral in which, there's lots of questioning on whether we should be going down this net zero pathway at all. In fact, even the current government is saying this is a reason to go further, albeit, I think, as I heard Doug say, by focusing more on the supply side than on the demand side, which I thought also was a mistake. A few comments on the specifics, though, in the review. I thought it was interesting that you haven't got a big section on the power sector, and I think that's the right thing to do, is to focus on the others where the problems are, gas, industry, transport. Yeah, I mean, I think Mike is right on gas, that there's still a need for a plan. Two things I sort of pick up on. One, Doug picked up on. I 100% agree. I don't know why this wasn't used as an opportunity to say, actually, here is our case for upgrading the building stock. We can help people with bills, we can help people with health, we can help reduce emissions, we can spread jobs around the UK, levelling up, blah, blah, blah. But somehow this government has put it in a box marked too difficult and aren't willing to go there. And I think it's, I really am at a loss.
Okay, very unfortunately, Jim, we have lost you. Can you hear us? You're muted. That's a real shame, because it was really, really interesting listening to what Jim had to say there. But it does seem as if his call has dropped out again temporarily. If we get a chance to bring him back in, then I certainly will. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move to the Q&A. So I've got the Q&A box up with a large number already of questions open. There's been some upvoting going on, and I'm roughly going to take them in the order of the kind of the priority order of how they appear in front of me on the screen. But I'm also going to jump around a little bit so that I can switch the topics about, and maybe where there's one or two questions that look a bit similar to one another, I might take them together rather than separately. I'm sorry, Jim, we lost you. You've now reappeared. Do you want to maybe make a couple of final comments? So I think you were saying that why didn't we seize the opportunity? It was resonating with what Doug had said, and you disappeared shortly after that.
Well,
I'm going to losing you again.
I'm going to confine myself to two questions I was going to ask to Mike and Nicky. So Mike, gas storage, you raised this in your piece, and obviously that's come back onto the agenda to deal with, the prices, or could it deal with the prices? Do you think the time is now to reopen Rough and to invest in more gas storage to try and blunt some of that volatility? Is it really going to help, or is this a red herring again? And I guess, Nicky, like you, I felt that one of the weaker parts of the net zero strategy was the whole approach to land, how it brought together, the use of land for energy, the use of land for carbon sequestration and storage and for BECCS and that sort of thing. Of course, the use of land for agriculture, which is a whole other set of issues, etc. And I just feel government isn't really there about understanding how all those bits and pieces fit together. So I suppose my question, I was intrigued by your mention of the Scottish approach in the recently announced strategy. Could you just say a bit more about that, whether that's really a model to follow? Are they ahead of the rest of the UK in terms of really getting that approach to land sorted out, which seems to me to be one of the biggest challenges we've got ahead of us? So I'll leave it there before I drop off again.
Okay, well, why don't we take those two questions? And I don't mind which order we take them in, but Mike, why don't you take them in the order that Jim posed them?
Okay, thanks, Jim. And I think I could also weave in a couple of the comments that came in the Q&A, because they also related to storage. I think that the short answer is that it's not going to make that much difference on the margins of the current situation. I mean, there are countries in Europe with far more storage than ours, although it's probably only about 60% full, who are still having to pay the same price. I think on reflection, it was probably a mistake not to consider retaining the capacity at Rough. We went from 15 days of storage to 5. One of the reasons we have to pay a premium in the winter, it's not so much to do with Brexit, as Paul Eakins has asked, it's more to do with the fact that because we don't have a lot of storage that we can draw on when gas prices peak, we have to pay a higher price to draw gas from Europe. And that includes Norwegian gas, which someone talked about. Norwegian gas itself is also in decline, and Norway wants to benefit from arbitrage between the European and UK prices, and is delivering gas at the NBP price. So I think I would say yes, but I think much of the discussion so far is about reconsidering Rough in the light of initially methane and then hydrogen, because I agree with pretty much all that Doug said, which is, I'd say, not surprising, but we haven't always seen eye to eye. But I don't see the point in investing millions in an infrastructure to support a resource we're supposed to be getting rid of. So I think actually the short term, the gas by design is about enabling us to accelerate the reduction away from fossil fuels and while we maintain physical and price security. And I think having more storage in a post-Brexit context is important. We're outside the solidarity mechanism. And I think today in Brussels, the European Union is announcing a plan whereby neighboring states in the European Union can club together to share storage to create a strategic gas reserve. We won't have any access to that. We're no longer a member. So maybe what we do need to look at is a need for a strategic gas reserve. In the short term, that gas being methane, in the longer term being hydrogen.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Nicky, over to you.
So it's a really interesting question, Jim, because their approach is really excellent. The idea is that they have local, regional land use partnerships. So it's about decentralization. And this is aiming to enable a just transition. So understanding what society needs and understanding environmentally what makes sense for those specific pilot areas. And there's 5 pilot areas underway. And I think the lessons from them look really positive. The difficulty is there's a conflict with national level legislation. So at the same time that this was released, the Scottish government also, the SNP released their capital investment plan. Now, in their capital investment plan was a huge amount of development of, for example, road building and motorways. So I think, which is obviously in direct conflict about what's trying to be achieved in these pilot level studies. So I think that the idea behind it is really great, this decentralization to enable local regional areas to ensure that they get what they need from their environment, but also from their energy supply and their transport. I think the difficulty is when it's not backed up by that higher level of legislation.
Okay, thanks, Nicky. I'm gonna turn to the Q&A now, and obviously these questions are slightly, or kind of principally, going to be addressed at the two speakers because the audience were responding to the presentations. But I welcome comments and contributions from the wider panel as well. Mike, I'm just going to press you a bit on Paul Eakin's question. I know that you kind of just partly answered it, but as far as my kind of not very well informed reading of this goes, there has been a divergence in price post-Brexit. So that would suggest to me there is a Brexit effect going on with regards to price formation in the GB market. Is that not right? You're still muted, by the way.
Had to happen, didn't it? I mean, divergence from other European hub prices.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're at the yes. Then and yes, I would say probably that is the impact of Brexit in the sense that we are competing, and there are also costs involved in moving that gas through the interconnectors, for example, which have to be factored in, and costs actually in entering our own gas system, the National Grid's NTS. And there at times, obviously, there's going to be currency risk because euros versus the pound and so forth. So all of those things probably are adding an element to the cost there that means that we're trading at a premium over and we've also no longer the European benchmark. And NBP used to be the European benchmark. The Dutch TTF is now the benchmark, and it's got more liquidity in that gas price, and that might explain some of it. So and maybe it's also the extent to which we're having to lean on LNG is explaining it. So all of those things probably mean that we are having to charge, pay a slight premium compared to some of the other European hubs to attract gas, and that's attributable to being outside the single energy market, no longer part of the European Union, perhaps. I don't think that's the major factor that's behind the current situation, but I think it was apparent even before this that was the case.
Okay. There's another question that you sort of answered, but I'm going to press you on it, and I think it's a really interesting question. It's from Judith Ward, and she asks, what are the main medium-term constraints on upping the supply of gas from Norway?
Well, interestingly, if you look at the seasonal supply of Norwegian gas, it's actually stepped in to replace our lack of storage so that we see more Norwegian gas coming in the winter. And when we had a lot of storage to fill, we would fill that in the summer, and and part of that would come from Norway. But as we haven't got rough to fill, what it means is we have to, and we don't have the capacity in our own North Sea fields, which we used to have to surge production in the winter. We're having to, there's greater seasonality in Norway's supply. And we've got pipelines dedicated to delivering gas from Norwegian sector straight to the UK. It's also the case that some Norwegian gas is coming through the UK North Sea infrastructure. But the background story is one of declining production in Norway. And obviously future exploration and development in Norway it's going ahead, but it may be more remote from the UK, which is a challenge. But as I mentioned before, Norway has pipelines directly into the European market as well. and wants to maximize revenue. So they have obligations to deliver to the UK, they have obligations to deliver elsewhere. So, I mean, I would say if it weren't for Norway, we'd be in a really bad situation. So we should be thankful for that. But I mean, significant expansion of production from Norway, the trend is the decline, not as rapid and significant as the trend that we're likely to see in the UKCS. So that's why the stopgap that's filling in the deficit is going to have to be an increasing reliance on LNG. And we've got the capacity to do that, the physical capacity. It's whether the UK is an attractive market. And I think we should remember that normally, when the global gas market is in equilibrium, Europe is the balancing market. Gas gets dumped in Europe when Asian buyers don't want it and won't pay a premium for it. That just hasn't happened. And I expect that things, will get back to some degree of normality, sort of April, May time, hopefully. But the conditions for a repeat of this may still be there. So, there's no easy answer. If it weren't for Norway, we'd be in a worse situation. There's no doubt about that. It's really this 20% of consumption, which is now covered by LNG, which has globalized our gas security.
And therefore marginal price.
Yes. As you saw that quite clearly in the relationship between the NBP price and the LNG spot price in Asia. Yeah,
understood. I think I'm going to switch the topic, which means that I'm missing a couple of the questions out in their priority order, but I will come back to them. I promise. And I'm not favouring Paul Eakins because he's my favourite ex-co-director of UKERC, but he asks a really interesting question. So Nicky, you didn't mention bioenergy, and I might direct this to Beth as well. You didn't mention bioenergy as a potential conflict between energy and the environment. Is that because you think it's less of a threat than some of the issues that you did mention?
No, I didn't mention bioenergy because I was short on time. And in that section of the talk, I could have given an hour-long talk on the different types of interactions and conflicts between the energy system. So I didn't not mention it because it's lesser importance. I think it is really interesting as an area. And those of you familiar with research will know that Gail Taylor and Rob Holland, and amongst many others within UKERC, have led a great deal of the research looking at this issue between bioenergy and environment. I think that what we know from that is that there is a conflict between the development of bioenergy. It certainly takes up a huge amount of land, but in many cases it's been shown that done in the right way, it can actually enhance biodiversity, or at least provide a similar level of biodiversity to an area that isn't using bioenergy. And one of the reasons behind this is because the majority of the bioenergy is grown on agricultural land, so land which was already developed and anthropogenically affected. So the conflict is there with regard to biodiversity, but I think one of the conflicts that's more interesting here is the conflict with agricultural land and development. So I didn't mention it because there was so many, but it is certainly a really interesting area.
I wonder if Beth, do you have anything to add on that, or indeed Doug or Jim or others?
I think Nicky's covered that really well. I do see a question on offshore wind farms and fisheries I could answer.
Well, let's come back. We'll come back to that one, I think. Yeah. Doug, did you just wave at me, or did I imagine it?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to say that the controversies around bioenergy, which are, of course, by no means confined to the UK, they're quite international. They're right across Europe and stretch into North America and even Asia. The challenge is not so much saying that it is possible to do bioenergy well, because it is possible to find feedstocks that are bioenergy that are helpful. Your sort of classic sawdust from sawmills that constitute genuine waste. But actually understanding the nature of markets and land use in the places where the bioenergy is being derived, when you move beyond those fairly easily definable wastes, becomes extremely complicated extremely quickly. And the history of trying to provide governance arrangements for commodities, particularly those that are largely corporate driven, is littered largely with failure. There are very, very few examples of where you can point and say, look, there's a good governance arrangement that allows us to source those commodities in a way that we could feel comfortable with the environmental impacts. And that's true whether you're talking wood or beef or coffee or palm oil. And so the question then becomes, are governments willing and able to put the time, energy, resource, and person power into making sure those governance systems are going to be there? And at the moment, you have to say the answer is no, they aren't. They show no signs of doing so. And so I think it's quite legitimate to be very skeptical about much of the claims around bioenergy and what it might do for us. And that includes BECCS.
All right. Okay. Doug, Jim, did you want to come in on this point? No, you're fine. Okay, so look, I'm gonna come back to the environmental stuff in a moment, but I'm just gonna jump back up a bit in the Q&A order.
Rob, I think Maureen was trying to get in.
Oh, sorry, Maureen. I please.
I probably should put my hand up really high.
Yeah. I wasn't expecting you to come in on this one, but please do. Yeah.
I'm coming in because I have a question rather than, the review didn't touch on very much about cost and who pays, but when we're thinking about, solving these conflicts, I wondered, Nicky, Mike, did you look at issues around who pays? One of the things we are doing at Ofgem is when we're looking at our decisions, is looking at distributional impacts, because it has to be paid for, and how it is paid for is very important. So, thinking about the conflicts you were just mentioning, Nicky, who pays, and will the cost be something that should be considered in solving those conflicts?
So this is where the point that I was raising about the payment for ecosystem service comes in. And this is what they've done in Costa Rica and the method that they've used there. And I think that if we can value monetarily these impacts on the environment, then it puts us in a position that those costs then can be internalized within the systems that are causing them. And you can internalize those costs in a range of different ways. You can internalize them through taxes, for example. You can internalize them by voluntary payments. And there's a whole host of different financial mechanisms to do this. So I think when you're talking about who pays, then you're looking primarily at the people who are causing the damages. So that would be the industries, for example. That would be the obvious place to start.
So that's a kind of polluter pays approach.
It's around internalizing those costs. So when, for example, an industry is using the environment and causing those external costs, like Beth said, there's a perception that this is free. So if we put an offshore wind farm in place and it causes damage to that environment and it's not monetized, then there's a sense that that impact is free. So no one has to pay for that. And the idea is that if you can then value that, you can then re-internalize that into the cost of the energy.
All right. I mean, that probably just passes it on to consumers, but let's park that, and that might have distributional impacts that we wouldn't want. So, but let's park that. There's an even more fundamental question. I was going to come back to this one, but since it's kind of popped in already, Oliver Broad was asking a question that was actually about the monetization of. So he says, what would you answer to those who might be concerned about the possible negative impacts of striving to put a monetary value for different environmental co-benefits? It's tricky and almost philosophically, isn't it?
So I think there's been a huge amount of debate around this over the last 30 years since we've been really pushing forward environmental valuation. I think it's really important to take a twin track always. So the monetary values are incredibly helpful because they do allow us to bring environment onto the same table as industrial development and commercial development. I've seen it happen before now. If you have got two sheets, and I mean, if you have got a balance sheet that's got all the costs and benefits of a particular development option, and at the bottom you have got environmental costs and a qualitative statement, for example, we will lose a certain amount of species. when it comes to making the decision, it's very easy for that qualitative statement to drop away. Now, if you can change that and have a number that sits alongside all the other numbers in the costs and benefits in that table, then that number is far more likely to actually stay in place in the decision-making process. It's much harder as a policymaker to ignore a number. It's a really good way to get traction about why the environment is so important. Now, that said, I think equally, we cannot capture all the value of an environment in a monetary figure. It would be foolish to say that we could. And there are definitely intrinsic values that we just can't manage to value. And that's why I say we need a twin track. So we have to have that understanding of the monetary, because that, in all honesty, is what makes a lot of difference in the decision-making process. Like it or not, that's the reality. But alongside that, it's important to have that understanding that there's a whole host of other values that are equally important, we have to make sure that we make those clear as well. So I think there's a place for both. And I'm an environmental economist by training, and I fully understand that we shouldn't be putting monetary values on everything in a completely blasé fashion, but they're certainly very useful in gaining some traction.
All right. Would anyone else like to come in on this one? Beth, yes?
Yeah, a few things. I absolutely agree with Nicky, and that ability to bring in some evaluation in a financial term allows you to work with those trade-offs then of what's going to happen in money terms. And like, for example, at the moment, if within offshore wind, we are going to move our fisheries out of large areas of the oceans. And right now, a lot of people think that's a great thing because, hey, presto, de facto marine protected areas. But not enough analysis has been done on what happens. Nothing else is changing to fisheries management at the moment. So you've got a lot of fishing activity then moved to a different spot. So in terms of looking at the trade-offs and looking at the costs of that, looking at the costs that could have come into the economy with fishing, that's not in the equation at the moment at all. And that's an easy one for people to think about because fisheries are costed. It gets even harder when you start to think about all the other animals involved, like seabirds and mammals and stuff that are involved in all of this change. So it does give us a start using financial, as much as a lot of us who are ecologists balk a little bit about doing that. It does give us that start, ability to put it in a model, ability to show the trade-offs even in money terms. And that is really valuable at the table.
Okay. I think go on then, quick one from Doug, because I'm just seeing just how many questions we've got unanswered at the moment.
I just say I'm not blind to the idea that you get some traction in processes, but I always go back to one of the early valuations of the Amazon rainforest, which put it about the same as the market capitalization of Google at the time. And of course, there are, intrinsically, these things are extremely difficult to value. And I also worry about the, what that does to decision makers who think they've somehow taken the environment into account, and they don't need to deal with all that squishy stuff about intrinsic value over there, which is very difficult to quantify. We've got good hard numbers here that we can deal with, and therefore everything else we don't need to worry about. So those are my concerns.
Okay, all right, good. Look, I'm gonna take the question, and I'm gonna slightly kind of paraphrase a question that we've got from Nigel Hargreaves, which is near the top, and we haven't taken it yet. He also asked a question about fusion, but I'm just going to wrap that in with this one. I'm going to put it to everybody actually, and my paraphrase will be: basically, is this the result of a failure of policy, that we should have gone faster, further and faster with low carbon, with renewables and nuclear? It says specifically. And therefore, we've kind of inevitably ended up in this situation with gas prices. Maybe we could have avoided it if we'd been a bit more. We could have avoided it if we could have anticipated it and hence avoided it with more ambition. I'm actually going to unfairly direct that at my predecessor. So, Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably go back to the point I was making before I was cut off, which is the energy efficiency program. I'm not going to say, look, we needed more supply in electricity, because frankly, that wouldn't have made that much difference. Yes, it could have done, But I think as Mike's Sankey diagram showed, you know, the gas is being used across the economy. It's the industry and household bit, which is the more durable, that hasn't gone down. So by doing a housing energy efficiency program, or continuing with what we had, and not chopping those programs at a high level of ambition with the harder to treat homes, well, certainly some of the political sting would have been taken out, but some of the direct impact on households would have been taken out. So that's my view on that. Just to answer his fusion question, my short answer is no. We've spent $1 billion plus on fusion in the UK public budget, and more through Euratom and other European programs. It still doesn't get any nearer. Occasionally science journalists get convinced it's just around the corner, but until they have a working prototype that actually puts out more energy than it takes in, I'm afraid I'm a skeptic that it's going to ride to our rescue.
Thanks, Jim. And we do pick up in the review on the heat and buildings strategy, and we do emphasise the absence of a policy for the able to pay households. And we picked up on that in the press release also as one of the things that we think could and should be done urgently now, because we need to do it if we're going to do heat pumps, but we could really help mitigate these kind of price fluctuations now with energy efficiency. Could we have gone further and faster though? I mean, that's still a legitimate question, even if it wouldn't have solved, if it wouldn't actually solve the gas crisis until we switch away from gas for heating. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? Doug? And Mike?
Yeah, go on, I'll have a go at that. And I mean, this is not hindsight to say, yes, we should have gone further and faster. I'll point to three specific, well, possibly four specific occasions. 2003 Energy White Paper, which I believe, Rob, you might even have been involved with, the PIU report prior to that, saying, you know, emphasising renewables and efficiency, let's get on with it. Not a lot happened, and then there was another white paper reorienting back towards nuclear, which didn't deliver anything for over 15 years. Then there's 2013, cut the green crap under David Cameron, emasculated the energy efficiency. Too much criticism, I should say. All of these points met with a great deal of criticism, saying you're doing it wrong. And then 2015, the end of the support for onshore renewables. All of those were mistakes. The governments of various colours were told they were mistakes at the time, and they went ahead and did them anyway.
Okay, Mike, did you want to make a point as well?
Just very quickly, because I mean, it's really a question of this sort of relationship between supply and demand, and you know, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we have pretty much got rid of coal, and we accelerated getting rid of coal. And we have expanded renewables, although there's no doubt there's a lot more we could do. And I do think the energy efficiency piece is really the missing part of the puzzle. You know, it's one of those win-wins, isn't it? I mean, if people had better insulated houses, their gas bills wouldn't be so high, whatever the cost of gas. And it's a requirement for decarbonising domestic heat, because you're going to need a better insulated building if you want to install a heat pump. So it is remarkable that so little progress has been made there. And actually, if you look back at the different strategy documents we had around energy security, around electricity market reform, a lot of that was predicated on building more gas-fired power stations. Now, interestingly, they never got built because maybe the market realized that there was no logic in building them. One of the other things, and I'm just going to kind of do a Jim around the fusion question here, I suppose, is there a question there about shale gas? And I, for one, am surprised that we've not had more people saying, well, the answer is we should have fracked. My short answer, like Jim, is no. Shale gas is dead. It's not going to happen in the UK. I doubt that it ever was going to happen, but it's clearly not going to happen now. And you know, the answer is not securing more sources of supply with very negative environmental impacts. So I don't see shale as an answer. In fact, the UK government in the last couple of days made it quite clear that it was not interested. There was no evidence of being able to address the conditions of the moratorium in relation to something that was happening with geothermal energy. So I think the emphasis should really be on the demand side as much as the supply side, as has been suggested. And this is about pivoting away from gas, but understanding that pivoting away We've still got to manage that supply and demand as gas demand falls, because we are a country that's very, very reliant on gas, particularly houses for heat. And it's not something you can do overnight. And unfortunately, we do probably need to sort of plan for the fact that progress won't be what we want. And we may need more gas than we really want to have in the gas mix. And given what's happening, that is an even bigger problem. So I would be really, look back and say, well, gas is now the problem. We've got rid of coal. Gas is the problem. We have to manage down gas and accelerate alternative solutions, not just the supply. I would say other sources of flexibility, because we've not really talked about that, is that gas does provide that flexibility and storage. And we need to replace that with other forms of low carbon flexibility and storage.
Mike, you must have been reading my mind. I don't know how you managed to do that, because we had a slightly rhetorical question from Ron Loveland pointing to the amount of flexibility that we get from line pack. And so I wanted to ask you all, including Maureen, actually from an Ofgem perspective, what do we need to do to get more? We know we're going to need more flexibility, and we need low carbon flexibility on the system. So what do we need to do to get more flexibility onto the system? Maureen, do you want to have a go at that one? And then maybe Jim and anyone else?
Before I get to that, I wanted to talk about the previous question. And I know the panel has answered that very well. I think another side, and you mentioned in your introduction, was about what's happening in the retail market. And I think there is a question for us on how we make it more resilient in going in the future. Now, would it have been expected the spike in prices? I don't know. I'm not quite sure anyone ever expected it to go that high. But today we publish a suite of about 9 documents about making the retail market more resilient, to situations like that. So I wanted to bring that angle in. Now you talk about greater flexibility. I think there is the consumer side that we have to think about, and I think that's really important, because getting flexibility also means whether consumers are going to respond and allow that to actually reach its fullness. So I would focus on the consumer side in terms of answering your question, and how do we get consumers to behave in a way that actually takes advantage of flexibility.
Okay, that's important. Beth, you're waving as well.
Yeah, I've got an answer for those 2 questions combined. The reminder that we are global leaders in tidal and wave energy in the design, and the UK policies have, pretty much brought that to a stop. Until very recently, the CFDs have been brought back as a ring fenced for tidal. And we also have an edge in floating wind, which will be the next thing rather than static wind. That really needs the investment right now. We could remain being the global leaders in that, but very quickly we'll lose that position if we don't fund those activities.
Okay, I think that's fair enough. Jim, do you want to comment on this, or any of the above, really?
On the flexibility question,
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think, the 2 things Maureen mentioned actually are connected in my mind now. That, the fact that we've had such problems in the retail market with many suppliers going bust, and therefore calls to reform that, it does raise questions about, well, then how do you build into that reform, whatever that looks like, more incentives for that flexibility? Because I'd imagine for many household consumers, issues of trust, which were never brilliant, according to previous UKERC work on this issue and other people's, has probably got worse. And so under what conditions are they going to be persuaded to play a role, given what digitalization can enable in helping flexibility in the electricity system in particular? And then there's also the issue, which at the other end of the scale, if you like, at the supply side, which Mike raised about gas by design. Well, again, if you're thinking about flexibilities there to integrate more and more renewables, just how can you build that into that management of that gas transition and maybe the transition to use of hydrogen in storage or in peaking plants and so on. So I don't have a kind of blueprint which I could put on the table and say this is how to do it, but I guess I'm noting that some of the real themes you've either picked up in your report or that have been picked up in the discussion, that needs to be part of what's considered there about, just how we have a set of incentives which take us to the next level of investment in renewables, which we're already, there's auctions going on and so on and so forth, but actually build in those signals for flexibility as well, which are key to making that work.
Okay, I mean, thanks all. Oh, Maureen, you've unmuted.
Yeah, and I just to add to what Jim just mentioned, and it's also through our incentivization, if there's such a word, of the network companies, right, through our real price control. So it's how we incentivize those low carbon technologies to come on board, which is a big part of what we're doing through, for instance, the strategic innovation funds. And other things. So that is a big part of enabling more flexibility online.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'm intrigued. I mean, Stuart Hazeldine has asked a question about the beast from the east and gas supply and prices, which we probably will run out of time for. But throughout the beast for the east, it was actually pretty windy. I think my concern on the flexibility front is the demand side can't make provision for an extended period of low renewables output. I was looking at some analysis that the Met Office and Climate Change Committee commissioned, the National Infrastructure and Climate Change Committee commissioned from the Met Office that is looking at the kind of distribution of these kind of events. And I do think that's, we have that's deeply concerning. I think I'll probably just abuse Chair's privilege and say that in the absence of time. I'm going to squeeze in one last question, and there's a question about adaptation. I'm really sorry for all of the other wonderful questions that we've had that we haven't got through, even a fraction of them. So I can only apologise, but some of them we have touched on. I think this one I don't think we have. Ross is asking, is there enough consideration to climate adaptation in energy policy? And I'll just go round and ask you all to give a quick, yes, no, and a few words, starting with Beth.
Sure, yes, this is something I've talked to wind industries, especially about, are they setting up gearing systems to deal with really low winds and really high winds instead of course, everybody's making, the same gearing system and economies of scale to just produce the same wind turbines. But we really need to think about the fact that mean wind speeds are going down, but variance is going up. And these low periods of wind are going to become much more common. So absolutely, that's a climate change adaptation that needs to be thought about. And that's, again, why plugging tidal energy, which is completely predictable. And if you can do that along with a storage capacity, tidal energy can produce a good, small but good predictable percentage for us. And that could be one of the ways to deal with climate issues.
Thanks, Beth. I'm actually conscious that if I try and go around everyone, we'll overrun in terms of time. So who would like to make a comment about adaptation? Wave at me if you would. Nicky and Jim.
I can really quickly. From an environmental perspective, particularly when we're looking at land use, it makes a huge difference, because where we decide to put renewable energies, bioenergy at this very moment in time, so it doesn't impact biodiversity, may well change in 20 years time, in 50 years time, because as we see the impact of climate change, biodiversity moves and shifts. So we have to be aware of this and climate sensitive when we're making these spatial plans about how we use both our land and our sea.
Okay, and Jim?
I think overall we probably spend more time on this than we used to. The CCC has its fairly active adaptation subcommittee. Of course, it doesn't just look at energy, it looks at everything. But I absolutely agree, we need to do more of it, looking not just at how the system's going to operate under current conditions, but stress testing it. My more recent experience is more on less developed countries where actually this isn't done. routinely for places which are much more stressed. So, you know, putting in new hydro dams in places where actually those hydro dams won't have enough water to operate in 10, 20 years time and that kind of thing. But I guess it's a reminder that even countries like the UK, which aren't suffering the same sort of climate impacts, still need to take that very seriously, you know, as we do, planning on such a long time scale.
Very quickly, Maureen, do you think Ofgem's doing enough on adaptation?
That's an interesting question. Are we doing enough? I would say, I mean, there's always room to do more, of course. So that's how I would leave my answer to the question. There's always room for us to do more.
Okay, I think that's perfectly fair, and I'm sorry for putting you on the spot on the very last minute of our time, which is now up. We're on 3 o'clock, and I'm aware that you've all got other things to do, but we've been running for quite a long time already. Listen, I mean, that was really, really fascinating for me. The questions that we got were really good ones. As said already, I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them. But I just think it shows the value of this exercise of doing an annual review, which was obviously initiated by Jim 5 years ago, as we've said. So that's all really. Thank you all for your participation. Thanks to all of the authors and to everyone behind the scenes on this Zoom call actually, but also on the production of the annual review and everything else that UKERC does. And we'll see you at all of our other workshops, events, and webinars and activities next year. And in the meantime, have a restful Christmas break. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye bye.